So Trump wants to rename the Department of Defense the Department of War.
All right?
That's coming
You
soon.
you let me know if you want to do it. I think Department of War. It just sounded bad. He said, sir, on behalf of the Department of Defense. Defense. I don't want to be defense only. We want defense, but we want offense too, if that's okay. So you'll make a decision. But as Department of War, we won everything. We won everything. And I think we're going to have to go back to that.
Honestly, the Department of War is a fitting name for the Defense Department. The Defense Department should, in theory, exist to protect the United States of America from external threats. The reality is that the Defense Department, for years, has been used as a tool to wreak havoc on the world, wage endless wars with no clear enemy or no boundaries, prop up the military-industrial complex, overthrow democratically elected leaders, and kill, maim, and displace millions of people from several countries. There hasn't been much defense in the Department of Defense for years. For decades, U.S. foreign policy has been dominated by a military-first approach despite demonstrably failing to achieve stated goals, countless lives lost, trillions of tax dollars spent, and destroying what, if any, moral standing the U.S. had on the world stage. The Trump administration and Republican-led Congress have gone a step further, completely eroding U.S. soft power by illegally dismantling the U.S. Agency for International Development and hollowing out our diplomatic corps at the State Department. The disparity between the budgets of the Department of Defense versus USAID and the State Department was already extreme. The U.S. was already spending over $900 billion more on the military than on our diplomacy and our development. And that was before U.S. aid was completely shut down and the State Department was hollowed out. Now, the Trump administration and Republican Congress have authorized more than $1 trillion to be spent on the military, while making further cuts to the diplomatic and foreign aid budgets, thereby further intensifying this disparity. This will do nothing to make America or the world safer. Instead, it will lead to the deaths of as many as 14 million people, the displacement of tens of millions, and so deep-seated resentment against the United States for decades. Any change to the current trajectory that we're on will require a massive swing in the balance of power in Washington. But even if Democrats eventually take control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, there's a serious risk that Democratic leadership would want to return to the pre-Trump status quo. That is just not good enough. We need a complete paradigm shift in how U.S. foreign policy operates globally. We need a robust, prevention-focused foreign policy that addresses the root causes and drivers of instability, fragility, and violence. A foreign policy that understands the globally connected world that we live in means that insecurity anywhere is a threat to security everywhere. It requires a reorientation of policy, of programming, and funding, moving away from crisis response and towards upstream prevention. Policymakers must recognize that a people-centered approach to foreign policy, prioritizing human security, is in the national interest of the United States. Trump campaigned on being the peace president, ending wars, getting the U.S. out of messy conflicts around the world. But since he's been in office, Trump and the Republicans in Congress have gutted all of the prevention and peace-focused efforts within our foreign policy, and instead invested solely in our military. It seems that Trump and the leaders of the Republican Party today love and glorify war. They want wars. They want more military action around the world. Trump is even deploying the military here at home in places like Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. Trump and the GOP dismantled U.S. aid because they claimed it was filled with waste, fraud, and abuse, a claim that was unfounded. But hello, the military is one of the most wasteful and abuse-filled agencies we have. The Department of Defense has never once passed an audit. There is zero monitoring and evaluation protocols within the military. Congress would regularly evaluate and scrutinize U.S. aid and State Department programs. The leaders from those institutions would go to the Hill and have to justify why those programs that they were running were worth investing in. The military, on the other hand, keeps getting basically a blank check, despite never being asked to prove the actions by the military are actually advancing strategic objectives, actually making America safe, or doing anything to improve the world. The military-first doctrine has dominated U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II. Between the end of World War II in 1945 and the start of the new century, the U.S. was involved in several wars and military actions across Africa, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, North America, and South America. The Cold War and the unfounded belief that communism posed an existential threat to the United States drove policy decisions for decades. During this time, the United States was directly or indirectly responsible for assassinations, coups against democratically elected leaders, often leading to the installation of brutal dictators in their place, as well as the proliferation of small arms and light weapons globally, some of which ended up being used against our own troops and our allies. Despite the seeming ubiquity of US military engagement in the post-World War II era, the post-9/11 era saw an unprecedented escalation in military spending and engagement. It was also during this time that the facade of US support for international law and norms began to erode before the US became fully hostile to global institutions. When we think about the invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, and the wider global war on terrorism, they serve as a stark reminder to the futility and immense cost of the military first doctrine. Brown University's Cost of War project estimates that at least 940,000 people have died due to direct war violence, while another 3.6 to 3.8 million people have died indirectly in post-9/11 war zones, and at least 38 million people were forcibly displaced from their homes. These figures don't even take into account all of the people who have died at the hands of militaries and police that were trained and equipped by US-funded security sector reform programs. In addition to the human costs, the Cost of War project estimates that these wars have cost US taxpayers as much as $8 trillion, not even accounting for the interest costs associated with the funds borrowed for the war. One might be willing to find a way to justify these immense costs, both human and financial, if the ends justified the means. But after nearly a quarter of a century of military action, the US government has little to show by way of concrete results from its actions. The Taliban are back in control of Afghanistan. Bombing campaigns in countries like Yemen and Somalia continued without any clear strategy or positive outcomes. Operations in Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere have resulted in further instability and insecurity that spread across the region. The post-9/11 era also saw a complete erosion of human rights, civil liberties, and true congressional oversight. The widespread use of torture, extraordinary rendition, and indefinite detention are an affront to domestic and international human rights and humanitarian law. The increased use of drone strikes expanded violence to areas outside of declared war zones and significantly increased civilian casualties with a complete lack of transparency or accountability. All of these actions, largely justified through the 2001 and 2002 authorization for the use of military force, have only been possible due to Congress's decision to give extremely broad powers to the office of the president with very little oversight. This decision and the inability for Congress to repeal the AUMFs have allowed 5 consecutive administrations to conduct military actions around the world without deliberation or approval from Congress. So while some might think it's crazy for Trump to even suggest renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War, honestly, I think it would just tear down this facade that we've created about what the true purpose of our military is. Trump has said on more than one occasion that we should take over places like Greenland, and Republicans have endorsed this idea. Republicans have made it pretty clear they aren't interested in defending the homeland. They're just interested in using the military to impose American capitalism and American might on everyone else around the world. So maybe the Department of War is what the Department of Defense should be called, because it's clearly not for defense.